Today I'll be refuting Brandon's claim that unmanned aircraft in the United States would be a beneficial addition to public and private sectors of the U.S. He makes three major secondary claims, the first being that drones could positively affect the economy, the second being that UAVs are quicker and easier to use compared to manned aircraft, and the third being that drones present less risk than conventional aircraft. Back to my opponent's first point, that drones could positively affect the economy. He used examples that they have a cheaper unit cost, they use less fuel, and then they're a cheaper alternative than renting a helicopter. Really, there is no argument behind these, they're just facts. No one's going to argue that a UAV is more expensive than a plane, it's just simply not true. And I don't think any of us really have a problem if someone goes out and rents a remote control plane or a UAV rather than a helicopter. So the real debate over UAVs being used is one about privacy and whether or not they break the Fourth Amendment, something that the original argument never stated. Rand Paul, a U.S. Senator, showcases the real issue behind drones being used in U.S. borders in a CNN interview where he states, "The domestic use of drones to spy on Americans clearly violates the Fourth Amendment and limits our rights to personal privacy. I do not want a drone hovering over my house taking photos." He goes on to say that a warrant needs to be issued to fly drones domestically. Now, in fact, one of my opponent's very own sources was called Protecting Privacy from Aerial Surveillance, and it was a whole paper about the benefits of drones, but then also how they can be misused to invade privacy, and it listed the different reasons, including voyeurism, discriminatory targeting, institutional abuse, and automated enforcement that were just completely overlooked in the original argument. As far as the second claim goes, that UAVs are quicker and easier to use compared to manned aircraft, again, there's no real argument. They are all good facts, but I don't think anyone's going to argue that I can fit a UAV in the back of my truck, but I can't fit a full-sized airplane. They're all great facts, but again, they're just sort of sidestepping the real issue about privacy. My opponent's third claim is that drones present less risk to conventional aircraft, but he missed valuable information about how often drones actually crash. According to an NBC article, drones are actually 30 to 300 times more likely to crash than small civil aircrafts. And for every 100,000 hours of flight seen for what they call a shadow UAV, just a specific type, 191 were completely destroyed or in need of what they consider drastic repairs in comparison to just 4 manned aircrafts. Also, drones have no standard of flight, and I think he mentioned that they can be flown using touchscreens, but they can also be flown using joysticks, computer keyboards, or even specialized remotes. These inconsistencies lead to pilot error, and actually a Department of Defense survey showed that 57% of accidents until 2005 were caused by flight control issues or complete engine or transmission failure in drones, and that 14% of failures were actually involved in lost communication links. And many of these problems don't arise in manned aircrafts. I mean, you're not going to lose communication with an aircraft or inside of it. While he was correct in saying that pilots are not killed in drone crashes, and he also said that law enforcement, they'd be a good use for law enforcement to help keep the officers safe. The FAA actually has not allowed drones to be used by the police agencies in the United States due to safety concerns. In an NBC article, they stated that the FAA hasn't allowed police agencies to fly drones over populated areas because of concerns about air-safe space or safety, as drones have crashed or collided with one another overseas. And to summarize, my opponent avoided the major issues related to drones. While giving us good facts, there was no real controversy behind his argument, and he missed valuable information about how often they actually crash. Without the information about how drones fall into the Fourth Amendment and whether or not they break privacy laws in the United States, we do not have enough information to make an informed decision that they would be a beneficial addition to public or private sectors of the United States.
All right, the claims are all pretty well labeled. I think on the first couple of points, you put it pretty simply. These are not disputes. There's no controversy on these particular points, and you explain why you don't think there's much controversy. You do suggest that the controversy has to do with the surveillance issues. It's kind of interesting. I think that that's a valid point, and that is in fact where the controversy is. But the very last piece of information suggests from the FAA that they're not being allowed to use these for those particular purposes. At least they're not being allowed to be used in the way that we think of them, as a substitute for helicopters or patrol kinds of things. I think that you're diminishing the only potential argument here. Not that it hurts your position at all. It's because your argument basically is that there is no argument here, and the only argument that exists is this other thing, which the advocate didn't even bring up. So it's an interesting point that's there, but it's also a little bit contradictory. The transition to the second point was also clear. Once again, the argument here is that there's not really any dispute. The third point is the risk issue, and I thought that this is where obviously you had the clearest clash with the advocate's claim about safety issues. The question of pilots obviously becomes irrelevant because there aren't pilots, but that doesn't mean that there isn't potential danger. And the fact that these things might be flown over populated areas and the frequency with which there are problems with communication, there are problems of the units being destroyed, and that there is a potential risk to people on the ground, for instance, as opposed to the pilots. I think that that's a good argument to develop there. The argument that there isn't a standard about how the drones fly, that there's inconsistency between whether they're remote controlled, whether they're being done with a joystick, whether it's computer programming, all those sorts of things. I thought that was a pretty good piece of information also that applies to this issue of general safety. Now, it's hard to quantify anything because our experience with this is relatively recent. I think one of the things that you might point out, for example, is that the argument here is being made in comparison to traditional aircraft. Well, how big a risk is there in traditional aircraft either? The truth of the matter is that the police use helicopters. How frequently do they lose somebody in those situations? We're not saying that there aren't helicopter crashes occasionally, but let's face it, how much more safe can it be if they're relatively safe in the first place? I think maybe that's an opportunity that you missed. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.